In Kerrville, Texas, 74-year-old Marine veteran hurled Becker stands tall at a Veterans Day ceremony, his dress blues gleaming with decades of honor. As the bugle plays taps, a young protester hurls red paint, staining Harold's uniform and shocking the crowd. Unfazed, Harold remains still, his silence louder than the chaos. With a single call on an old military flip phone, he summons not police, but Marines. As helicopters hum and boots march in, the town braces for a reckoning. What will the Marines' arrival mean for this fractured moment? The air crackles with anticipation. If Harold's story of quiet courage moved you, join us in honoring those who stand for honor. Subscribe, like, and share this video to keep these stories alive. Comment your thoughts. Let's discuss what respect means today. Support our channel to ensure more tales of dignity reach you. The protester's voice trembled with raw anger, his words slicing through the crisp autumn air like a blade. "That uniform is nothing but a costume for murderers," he shouted, his eyes blazing with conviction. His hand gripped a can of vibrant red paint, and with a fierce swing, he launched it toward Master Sergeant hurled Becker. The can tumbled end over end, a vivid streak of color cutting through the gray November sky until it exploded against the old Marine's chest. The paint splattered across his pristine dress blues, dripping down into the rows of metals that gleamed with decades of sacrifice. It seeped into the sharp creases of his uniform, staining the fabric that had been pressed with meticulous care just hours before. Harold stood motionless, his face a mask of stoic calm. The crowd around Maplewood Park gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to freeze the moment. A city official stepped forward, hand outstretched as if to shield the old man, but Harold didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief second, his weathered face softening. In that fleeting pause, it was as if he were listening to the whispers of ghosts only he could hear, comrades lost to time, their laughter and cries echoing in his memory. Behind him, the crowd churned with emotion. Some faces twisted in outrage, their fists clenched at the audacity of the act. Others stood in stunned silence, unsure how to process the desecration of a man who embodied their town's quiet pride. The protester, a young man with wild hair and a defiant grin, stood his ground, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He seemed to revel in the chaos he'd unleashed, his smirk a challenge to the old Marine's dignity. But hurled Becker didn't meet that challenge with words or fists. Instead, he reached into his pocket with deliberate calm and pulled out an ancient flip phone, its worn edges a testament to years of use. He didn't dial the police or snap a photo to fuel the crowd's anger. No, he called something older, something deeper, a bond forged in blood and brotherhood. Moments later, the ground beneath Maplewood Park began to tremble faintly, a low rumble that grew into the unmistakable sound of boots on pavement. When the Marines arrived, they didn't come with speeches or fanfare. They came with steel in their eyes, their movements precise and silent, a living testament to the legacy Harold carried. At 74, hurled Becker was a man whose presence spoke louder than words. His walk was deliberate, each step measured with the weight of a lifetime in service. His shoulders, though slightly stooped by age, remained squared, as if the discipline of the Corps still coursed through his veins. His boots, polished to a mirror-like sheen, clicked softly against the ground, a rhythm that echoed parade grounds long past. The years had silvered his hair and slowed his gait, but they hadn't dimmed the fire in his eyes or the resolve in his heart. He lived alone in a modest brick house on the outskirts of Kerville, Texas, a single-story home that blended into the quiet neighborhood. No flags flew in his yard, no plaques adorned his walls. The only hint of his past was a faded Marine Corps decal on his mailbox, its edges peeling from years of sun and rain. A simple porch swing hung on his front porch, swaying gently in the breeze. Though Harold rarely sat in it, he preferred to keep moving, to keep serving, as if stillness might let the memories catch up. To those who knew Kerville, Harold was a legend, though he'd scoff at the word. He never spoke of his medals unless pressed, and even then he brushed them off as if they were trinkets from a carnival. But the truth was etched in the lines of his face, in the scars hidden beneath his sleeves. 2 tours in Vietnam had taught him the cost of war. Jungles thick with fear, nights shattered by gunfire, and the weight of carrying men who'd never walk again. 3 deployments in the Gulf had added to his burden, each one carving deeper into his soul. A Bronze Star with valor and a Purple Heart lay tucked in a small wooden box in his bedroom, next to a dog-eared photograph of the men he'd lost. Their faces, frozen in youth, haunted him still. His nickname, Red, wasn't for the auburn hair of his younger days. It came from a mission in Vietnam where he dragged 2 wounded Marines through a hail of bullets to safety, his uniform soaked crimson by the time the helicopter landed. He'd never forget the medics' faces, their hands slick with blood as they fought to save his brothers. Retirement hadn't dulled Harold's sense of duty. Every week he drove to Kerville High School to mentor the ROTC cadets, his voice steady as he taught them about honor and sacrifice. Every Sunday he sat at the VFW hall, listening to younger veterans share their struggles, offering quiet wisdom born of experience. And on every holiday that mattered, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Independence Day, he donned his dress blues, the medals gleaming, the shoes polished to perfection. He'd tell anyone who asked that it wasn't for him. It was for the ones who never came home, the ones whose names were carved into the granite memorial at Maplewood Park. His knees ached from decades of carrying heavy loads, and his right hip throbbed from a training accident in Okinawa that had never healed properly. But Harold never complained. He walked every wreath to the memorial himself, his steps slow but unwavering, refusing the cane his doctor had prescribed. The town didn't ask him to do it. He just did, because that's who he was, a man who held Kerville together with quiet strength. Maplewood Park was a humble place, a small patch of green tucked behind City Hall. A few benches lined its paths, their wood weathered by time. A row of flagpoles stood sentinel, their flags snapping in the breeze. At the park's heart was a simple granite memorial, its surface etched with the names of Kerville's fallen. On Veterans Day, the park transformed, drawing townsfolk in droves to honor those who'd served. Harold was always there, his presence a quiet reminder of what service meant. The Protesters Act had threatened to tarnish that day, but Harold's response had reclaimed it. As the Marines moved through the crowd, their silent authority restoring order, Harold stood tall, the paint drying on his uniform like a badge of resilience. Every young Marine who left Kerville shook his hand before deploying, seeking the blessing of a man who'd walked through fire. And when they returned, many found their way to his porch, drawn by a respect that recognized its own. In the heart of a small Texas town, the little park on Main Street had transformed into hallowed ground by mid-morning. Rows of folding chairs, their metal frames glinting faintly under the relentless sun, stood neatly arranged on the dew-kissed grass. The high school band, clad in maroon blazers that didn't quite match, some too tight, others hanging loose, clutched their brass instruments, the trumpets and tubas catching the light like beacons. Their young faces, flushed with both nerves and pride, betrayed the weight of the moment. In the front row sat a line of veterans, their weathered hands gripping canes or resting on the arms of wheelchairs. Their eyes, some clouded with age, others sharp with memory, carried stories no one could fully grasp. Behind them, families huddled close, clutching small American flags that trembled in their hands. Many wore ball caps embroidered with the names of units disbanded decades ago, silent tributes to battles fought and comrades lost. At the center of this quiet reverence stood Harold "Red" Becker, a man whose presence seemed to anchor the entire scene. His uniform was immaculate, the brass buttons polished to a mirror-like sheen, his ribbons meticulously aligned across his chest. His posture was unyielding, a testament to a discipline forged in fire, the kind of dignity that time couldn't erode. Harold's heart, though, was heavy with unease. He wasn't one for the spotlight, never had been. Speeches felt like traps, words too flimsy to carry the weight of what he'd seen. Yet today, the town had insisted he be the honored guest. The mayor, a wiry man with a crumpled sheet of paper in hand, had practically begged him. Even the high school principal, whose father had served alongside Harold in the jungles of '68, had shown up, his handshake firm, but his eyes misty with inherited gratitude. Harold's chest tightened at the thought of all these people looking to him, expecting something profound. He didn't feel worthy, but they believed he was, and that belief pinned him to the spot. The ceremony began with the mayor's welcome. his voice wavering as he read from his notes, striving for solemnity but stumbling over his own earnestness. The high school band launched into America the Beautiful, the notes wobbling here and there, but brimming with a sincerity that made the imperfections forgivable. Families bowed their heads during the prayer, a soft murmur of "Amen" rippling through the crowd. Then came the roll call of the fallen, each name read with care, a quiet knife twisting in the hearts of those who remembered. Finally, the wreath laying, a moment meant to seal the morning in quiet honor. But that's when the air shifted, pierced by voices sharp and unyielding. Just beyond the park's iron fence, a group of about a dozen protesters had gathered, their signs jagged with bold accusatory words. War is not honor, no more blood for power. Uniforms are not sacred. Some wore masks, their anonymity a shield for their defiance. Others held smartphones aloft, capturing the scene, their lenses cold and unblinking. Their chants rose, loud and raw, teetering on the edge of chaos, but not quite crossing it. The police, stationed at a cautious distance, watched with weary eyes, their hands resting lightly on their belts, tense but restrained. The crowd in the park bristled, a collective breath held. A young mother, her face etched with worry, pulled her son closer, his small flag drooping in his hand. An older veteran, his jaw tight, muttered something under his breath, the words too low to catch but heavy with resentment. The band's music faltered, then stopped, leaving a silence that felt brittle, like glass about to shatter. Everyone could sense it. A storm was brewing, not in the cloudless sky, but in the hearts of those gathered. Harold stood motionless, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Inside, his pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the instincts of a man who'd faced chaos before. He'd been in enough battles to know when the air grew heavy with intent, when something was about to break. The protesters weren't done, he could feel it, and the weight of their anger pressed against the fragile reverence of the moment. As the ceremony pressed on, the notes of taps floated into the November air, slow and mournful, each note a delicate thread tying the crowd to the past. The bugler, a lanky boy no older than 17, stood near the memorial stone, his cheeks puffed with effort, his eyes focused on the task. The flags, held by children and adults alike, barely stirred in the still air. Even the protesters fell mostly silent, as if the sacred sound held them at bay, if only for a moment. But then, movement. A figure broke from the group at the fence, younger than the rest, maybe 25, his black hoodie swallowing the light. His jaw was sharp, his eyes blazing, not with grief, but with a fury that seemed to burn through him. He shoved past a fellow protester who reached for his arm, shaking off the restraint with a jerk. He moved with purpose across the small lawn, heading straight for the wreath-laying platform. The security, if it could be called that, consisted of two older city volunteers in bright orange vests, their faces frozen in confusion. No one had expected trouble during taps, that sacred pause when even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The young man's steps were deliberate, his hand tucked beneath his sleeve, gripping a small metal can, a spray paint canister, its presence a quiet threat to anyone who recognized it. The bugler played on, oblivious, his notes steady despite the growing tension. The protester didn't shout, not yet. He waited, his eyes locked on the platform, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and conviction. To him, this ceremony wasn't sacred, it was a lie, a glorification of violence dressed in ribbons and brass. He didn't see Harold's dignity, only a symbol of everything he despised. And in that moment, as he neared the platform, the morning balanced on a razor's edge, every heart in the park beating with the question of what would come next. 40 feet from the war memorial, where the crisp scent of shoe polish tangled with the earthy decay of autumn leaves, the air felt heavy with reverence. The crowd stood in solemn silence, their breaths visible in the chilly November air, as the bugler's mournful notes of taps drifted over the gathering. Veterans, families, and city officials had come to honor the fallen, their faces etched with a shared grief that needed no words. Then, like a blade slicing through the fragile moment, a voice erupted, raw and venomous. "That uniform's nothing but a murderer's costume." Heads whipped around. The mayor, mid-sentence in his prepared remarks, froze, his jaw slack, eyes wide with shock. A woman in the crowd let out a sharp, "Hey!" but the word was swallowed by the chaos that followed. The protester, a wiry man with a face flushed with conviction, stood defiant, his chest heaving as if the shout had drained him. His eyes burned with a fire that spoke of sleepless nights and festering anger. A man who'd carried his rage like a torch for years. With a sudden, violent jerk of his wrist, he flung a can of paint through the air. It spun once, glinting in the pale sunlight, before bursting open, unleashing a thick, blood-red stream that arced toward the front of the crowd. The paint struck Master Sergeant Harold Becker square in the chest with a wet, resounding slap. It exploded across his pristine dress uniform, splattering the meticulously polished brass buttons and seeping into the fabric of his jacket. Crimson streaks bled through the rows of ribbons pinned above his heart, each one a hard-earned testament to battles fought and brothers lost. The paint dripped down, pooling at the hem of his coat, staining the polished leather of his belt, and trickling onto the mirror-like toes of his black dress shoes. Harold had spent hours that morning buffing those shoes, his hands moving with the muscle memory of decades in service, each stroke a ritual to honor the day. Now the red insult clung to his metals, obscuring the symbols of sacrifice he wore with quiet pride. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, sharp and jagged, like the sound of glass shattering. A young girl no older than 6 clutched her mother's hand and began to see her small frame trembling at the sudden violence of the moment. An older veteran, his face weathered by time and war, let out a low, guttural growl, his hands tightening into fists as he struggled to contain the fury bubbling inside him. The mayor stood rooted to the spot, his hand half raised in a futile gesture, as if he could will the scene to rewind. Around them, phones were already out, cameras clicking and recording, capturing the outrage for a world that would dissect it later. But Harold didn't move. He stood tall, his posture rigid, eyes fixed forward as if still on a parade ground. The cold paint ran down his neck, soaking into his collar, but he didn't flinch. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't even blink. Inside, Harold's mind was a storm. The paint wasn't just an attack on his uniform. It was a desecration of everything he'd carried for decades. The weight of fallen comrades, the screams of battle, the quiet moments of brotherhood in the dark. He closed his eyes for a fleeting moment, not out of exhaustion, but something heavier, more profound. It was as if the paint had cracked open a vault of memories he'd long kept locked away. He saw faces, Private Malone, who'd shared his last cigarette before a firefight, Lieutenant Carter, who'd never made it back from that dusty road in Helmand. Names not etched on the memorial behind him, but carved into his soul, carried in the blood that still pulsed through his veins. The protester's words echoed in his head, murderer's costume. And they stung, not because they were true, but because they trivialized the cost of the uniform he wore. The protester, emboldened by the crowd's stunned silence, raised both fists, his voice cracking with fervor. "No more killers in uniform," he shouted, his words dripping with a righteousness that felt both desperate and triumphant. He began to back away, his sneakers scuffing the pavement, as 2 elderly security volunteers, their faces flushed with indignation, pushed through the crowd. They grabbed his arms, their grips firm but shaking with age. The protester didn't resist. He let them hold him, a faint smile curling his lips, as if he believed he'd struck a blow that would echo beyond this moment. To him, the paint was a statement, a victory, a way to scream his truth to a world he felt had ignored him for too long. The silence that followed was thick, rippling outward like a stone dropped in still water. The bugler, a young man in a crisp uniform, lowered his trumpet, his hands trembling slightly as he looked to the veterans for guidance. The city officials, dressed in their somber suits, exchanged helpless glances, their authority useless in the face of such raw confrontation. The veterans in the front row, men and women who'd seen wars the protester could only imagine, rose slowly from their folding chairs. Their eyes blazed with a fury born of loyalty to their country, their fallen, and to Harold, who stood drenched in red but unbowed. One of them, a woman with silver hair and a purple heart pinned to her chest, clenched her jaw so tightly it seemed her teeth might crack. She wanted to charge the protester to make him understand the weight of his actions, but something in Harold's stillness held her back. For the first time, Harold moved. Not to shout or to fight, but with a deliberate calm that seemed to anchor the chaos around him. He reached into the inner pocket of his paint-soaked jacket, his fingers brushing past the wet fabric, and pulled out a relic from another time. A gray, scratched military-issued flip phone. It was an old model with a monochrome screen and a stubby antenna, the kind of device that belonged to an era of desert deployments and handwritten letters. It was a piece of his past, a tether to the men and women he'd served with, a tool not meant for casual calls, but for moments that demanded action. The crowd watched, puzzled, as he flipped it open with a familiar, satisfying snap. It hadn't been used in years, not since his last reunion with his unit at Camp Lejeune, where they'd laughed and mourned over beers and memories. This phone wasn't for idle chatter. It was tied to a secure military line, known only to a dwindling handful of veterans who'd shared his war. Harold's thumb hovered over the single button that mattered, his heart pounding with a mix of resolve and sorrow. He pressed it, holding it down for a moment longer than necessary, as if to steady himself. The line didn't ring, no hold music, no automated prompts, just a brief tone followed by a voice, calm and clipped, unmistakably military. U.S. Command Liaison, identification. Harold's voice was steady, though his chest ached with the weight of the moment. Master Sergeant Harold Becker, Code Alpha 74, retired status. He spoke with the precision of a man who'd given countless sit-reps under fire. But inside he was wrestling with a flood of emotions. Anger at the protesters' ignorance, grief for the names he carried, and a quiet determination to honor the uniform now stained with red. No one in the crowd knew who he was calling or why, but the expression on his face, resolute, unyielding, haunted, told them one thing. This was far from over. The air felt heavy in Maplewood Park, Kerville, Texas, where the scent of fresh-cut grass mingled with the faint tang of paint from Harold Becker's worn jacket. His breath came in shallow, controlled bursts, each one a quiet testament to the storm brewing inside him. A veteran's ceremony meant to honor sacrifice and service had been shattered by a single brazen act, an assault on a uniformed soldier right there in front of civilians, families, and children clutching tiny American flags. The uniform, a symbol of everything Harold had once poured his life into, had been defiled in broad daylight. His heart thudded with a mix of fury and sorrow, but his face remained a mask of calm resolve. He knew what he had to do. Harold stepped away from the chaos, his boots crunching against the gravel path, and pulled out his old flip phone. His call wasn't to the local police, who were already floundering, or to the media for attention. No, this was a call to something deeper, something sacred. He dialed the number he hadn't used in years, his voice steady as he reported the protocol breach. Honor compromised, he said, the words heavy with meaning, a phrase that carried the weight of decades of service. It wasn't just a report, it was a summons, a call to the core of what he and others like him had sworn to protect. On the other end, there was a pause, a breath, then a crisp acknowledgement. Understood. Confirm intent. Harold's resolve didn't falter. Maplewood Park, Kerville, Texas. Civilian presence high. Suspect in custody. Civil unrest possible. His words were clipped, precise, but beneath them ran a current of unspoken pain. Pain for the disrespect, for the tarnishing of something he'd given his life to uphold. The voice on the line shifted, no longer just a procedural response. Keys clacked faintly in the background, a sound that grounded Harold in the moment. Then came the reply, firm and resolute. Master Sergeant Becker, this is Major Elias Talend, Active Liaison Command, 2nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. We're on training ops less than 20 miles east. We're moving now. Harold's chest tightened, not with fear, but with a quiet surge of pride. He could picture Major Talend, a man he'd never met, standing in some temporary command post, his eyes narrowing as he processed the situation. Harold knew what this meant. The Marines were coming, not for vengeance, not for show, but because some things were non-negotiable. How many assets? Harold asked, his voice low but steady. Talend's response was immediate, unwavering. Sufficient to ensure presence, protection, and principle. under 10 minutes. You'll know when we arrive." Harold gave a slow nod, though no one could see it. "Appreciate the speed," he said, his words carrying a gratitude that ran deeper than courtesy. "You called it, Master Sergeant." "We just answer," Talan replied, and the line went dead. Harold closed the phone with deliberate care, sliding it into the pocket of his paint-stained jacket. Around him, the ceremony site was a frozen tableau of shock and confusion. The protester, now cuffed and slumped on the curb, was surrounded by a handful of overwhelmed volunteers and a single city officer barking into his radio for backup that wasn't coming fast enough. The mayor, his face pale and drawn, stood in a hushed, frantic conversation with a councilwoman who gestured wildly at the defaced memorial wreath, its once pristine ribbons now smeared with paint. The crowd had splintered into clusters, some muttering angrily, others standing in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the protester and the ruined wreath. Children clung to their parents, unsure of what they'd just witnessed. Harold, though, stood apart, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. His silence wasn't one of shock. It was the stillness of a man who knew what was coming. He hadn't called for help. He'd called for honor, and in the world he'd once walked in uniform, that meant something precise. It meant boots on the ground. It meant steel. It meant the Marines. The park buzzed with tension, the air thick with the crowd's murmurs and the faint wail of a distant siren. Harold's mind drifted, not to the protester or the chaos, but to the years he'd spent in service. The weight of the uniform, the oaths he'd taken, the brothers and sisters who'd stood beside him. This wasn't about one man's anger or one moment's disrespect. It was about what the uniform represented, what the wreath stood for, what the flag meant to those who'd carried it into battle. His jaw tightened as he thought of the countless ceremonies he'd attended, the names read aloud, the memories that lingered like ghosts. To see that mocked, to see it defiled in front of children and families, it struck at something fundamental, something he couldn't let pass. Then, faintly at first, a sound broke through the haze of voices, a low, rolling hum, like thunder creeping across the Texas hill country. Most of the crowd didn't notice, too caught up in their arguments or their shock. A few tried to approach Harold, offering words of comfort, but he remained still, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't need their words. He'd already made his call. The hum grew louder, more distinct, rhythmic, and purposeful. Two children playing near the edge of the park stopped, their small faces turning upward, eyes wide with curiosity. Harold followed their gaze. Above the rooftops of downtown Kerville, the sky seemed to shift, the clouds parting as two dark shapes emerged. Marine UH-1Y helicopters, their rotors slicing through the morning air with a deliberate, unmistakable cadence. They didn't circle or hover. They announced their presence with a weight that pressed against the chest of everyone in the park. The crowd fell silent, heads craning skyward as papers lifted from benches and traffic lights swayed in the sudden gusts. Then came the ground response. From every major street feeding into the downtown square, tactical vehicles rolled into view, not police cruisers or National Guard trucks, but Marine Corps hardware, the kind that belonged in documentaries or distant battlefields. MRAPs, Humvees, LAV-25s, their engines growled low, their tires gripping the pavement like steel fists. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just the steady, relentless advance of men and women who understood what was at stake. Harold's heart swelled, not with triumph, but with a quiet certainty. The Marines had answered, just as he'd known they would. The crowd's murmurs turned to gasps, then to a hush. The protester, still cuffed on the curb, looked up, his defiance fading into something closer to fear. The mayor and councilwoman froze, their conversation forgotten. The officer lowered his radio, his mouth slightly agape. Harold, though, didn't move. He didn't need to. The silence in the park had changed again. It wasn't waiting anymore. It was witnessing. And in that moment, Harold Becker, Master Sergeant, retired, felt the weight of his call settle into place. Honor had been compromised, but it would not go unanswered. Not today. Not in Kerville, Texas. Not while the Corps still held. The world around Harold Becker seemed to pause, as if the very air held its breath. Just 8 minutes after his call, the sleepy rhythm of Kerville was shattered. The town's familiar hum, of morning commuters, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, and children laughing on their way to school, gave way to something heavier, something resolute. City buses screeched to a halt, their drivers stepping out with wide eyes clutching their radios. Civilian cars pulled over haphazardly, their owners abandoning them to stand on the curb, phones raised, capturing the moment. Storefront owners, some still in aprons, emerged from their shops, their faces a mix of confusion and awe. The sharp, rhythmic thud of boots on pavement echoed through the streets, a sound that stirred something primal in everyone who heard it. It was the sound of purpose, of unity, of a force that would not be ignored. Row after row of United States Marines, clad in full combat gear, marched into view. Their utility uniforms were crisp, their vests strapped tight, their helmets casting shadows over faces set in quiet determination. Each carried a service rifle, barrels angled low but ready, a silent promise of readiness. They moved with a precision that spoke of countless hours of training, their steps synchronized, their eyes scanning the crowd. They didn't shout orders or wave their weapons. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to command the scene. Slowly, methodically, they fanned out across Maplewood Park, forming a living barrier around the memorial at its heart. The wreaths, still fresh from the morning ceremony, seemed to stand taller under their protection, the crowd around them falling into a hushed reverence. Harold Becker stood at the center of it all, his dress blues marred by a vivid streak of red paint that dripped from his chest to his polished shoes. His heart pounded, not with fear or anger, but with a quiet pride that burned brighter than the shame of the vandalism. He had seen worse than paint in his years of service, mud, blood, and fire, but this act had cut deeper. It wasn't just his uniform that had been defaced, it was the memory of his brothers, the ones who never came home. Yet now, as he watched the Marines encircle him, he felt a swell of gratitude so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. He wasn't alone. He never had been. The townsfolk, too, felt the weight of the moment. Margaret, who ran the bakery across the street, clutched her apron, her eyes misty as she remembered her late husband, a Vietnam vet. She'd been furious when she saw the young man hurl the paint, his smug grin igniting a rage she hadn't felt in years. Now, as the Marine stood sentinel, she felt a quiet vindication, a sense that justice didn't always need words. Tom, a mechanic who'd never served but had grown up idolizing his Marine uncle, stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He'd wanted to tackle the protester himself, but now he saw something greater unfolding, a reminder that some things were bigger than any one man's anger. Even the Kerville police, who had struggled to contain the earlier chaos, seemed to exhale in relief. Sergeant Emily Carter, a 10-year veteran of the force, approached the lead Marine officer, her hands raised in a gesture of deference. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear but from the sudden realization that she was out of her depth. "Sir, we weren't told about this deployment," she said, her eyes darting to the rifles, the vests, the sheer number of Marines. The officer, a captain with a face carved from stone, met her gaze with a calm nod. "We're not here to step on toes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. "We're here to protect what's already been disrespected." Emily nodded, stepping back, her shoulders relaxing. She understood this wasn't about jurisdiction. It was about honor. The protesters, who had been so bold just moments before, now stood frozen. Their signs, once thrust high with slogans scrawled in angry marker, drooped in their hands. Their chants, once piercing and defiant, had dissolved into silence. A young woman with a nose ring, who had laughed as the paint splattered Harold's medals, now stared at the ground, her cheeks burning with something she couldn't name. Shame, perhaps, or fear. The man next to her, who had mocked the old man in costume, felt his bravado evaporate as the Marines' steely gazes swept over him. They were surrounded not by aggression but by a quiet, unyielding strength that made their defiance feel small, childish. The young man who had thrown the paint was long gone, whisked away by police, but the ripple of his actions lingered, a dark undercurrent in the stillness. No one fled, no one screamed. This wasn't an attack, nor was it meant to intimidate. It was a statement, pure and unshakable. The Marines' presence was a living testament to the Corps' unwavering loyalty to its own, a vow that stretched from the battlefields of the Bund to this small town park. They stood for Harold, for the memorial, for the fallen whose names were carved in stone behind them. They stood for a truth that needed no explanation. Disrespect would not go unanswered, especially not on a day meant to honor sacrifice. Harold's chest swelled as he stood his ground, the red paint now a badge of resilience. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The Marines around him were his voice, their formation a shield not just for him, but for every veteran who had ever felt forgotten. His thoughts drifted to his old platoon, to the men who had laughed with him, fought with him, died beside him. He could almost hear their voices now, steady and strong, telling him to hold his head high. The town, too, seemed to grasp this unspoken truth. This wasn't about vengeance or ego. It was about a bond forged in blood and sacrifice, a reminder that some things, some people, could not be diminished. The air grew heavier as the final vehicle in the convoy rolled to a stop at the edge of the park. A matte black Marine MRV, its armor scarred from distant battles, stood like a monument to resilience. The crowd parted as a figure emerged, his presence commanding instant respect. Colonel Jonathan McCabe was no stranger to moments like these. He carried himself with a quiet authority that needed no fanfare, his every movement precise, from the way he adjusted his gloves to the way his eyes swept the perimeter, missing nothing. The eagle, globe, and anchor on his chest gleamed in the morning light, a symbol that seemed to pulse with the weight of history. He moved through the line of Marines, his boots silent on the grass, his face unreadable, but his purpose clear. When he reached the memorial center, Colonel McCabe paused before Harold Becker, whose paint-stained uniform stood in stark contrast to the pristine gear around him. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, a silent exchange that spoke of shared sacrifice, of battles fought in different times but with the same heart. McCabe stood at attention, his posture flawless, and offered a salute, sharp, deliberate, held just a heartbeat longer than protocol demanded. Harold, with a slow, steady motion, returned it, his hand trembling not from age but from the weight of the moment. The gesture was more than military. It was a vow, a promise that neither man would ever stand alone. Then Colonel McCabe turned to the crowd, addressing them with a voice that wasn't raised but carried like a cannon's echo. "This uniform is not a target," he said, his words measured, yet unyielding. "It is a legacy. It stands for the service and sacrifice of men and women who gave everything for this nation." His gaze swept over the townsfolk, the police, the protesters, each word a stone in the foundation of truth. We're here today because that legacy was challenged, and we stand to remind you that it will not be diminished. The park seemed to still, the world narrowing to the colonel's voice and the silent ring of Marines. Harold's eyes glistened, his heart full. This was about more than one man or one day. It was about a truth as enduring as the stone behind him. Some symbols never fall, and some men are never truly alone. In the heart of Kerville, a small town draped in the quiet pride of its history, a ceremony to honor veterans unfolded under a gray autumn sky. The air was heavy with reverence, the kind that settles into the bones of those who understand sacrifice. Men and women stood tall, their uniforms crisp, their faces etched with memories of battles fought and comrades lost. Among them was Master Sergeant Harold Becker, his chest adorned with medals that gleamed faintly in the muted light, each one a silent testament to years spent holding the line when others faltered. His eyes, steady but weary, scanned the crowd, searching for meaning in the faces that had gathered to pay their respects. He wondered if they truly grasped the weight of the oath he'd kept long after the gunfire faded and the world moved on. Colonel McCabe stood at the podium, his voice a low, resonant force that carried the gravity of command. "Every man and woman who stood when others ran," he began, his words deliberate, each syllable a hammer striking steel, "who bled so others wouldn't have to, who kept their oath long after the war was over. These she-show are the souls we honor today." He paused, letting the truth of his words ripple through the crowd, a solemn wave that silenced murmurs and stilled restless hands. His gaze, sharp and unyielding, met the eyes of those before him, and in that moment he felt the weight of their collective strength, their shared resolve. "When you strike at one of us," he continued, his voice rising like a tide, "you strike at all of us." The crowd held its breath, the words sinking deep, binding them together in a vow older than the town itself. He turned, Facing the sea of faces, veterans with weathered expressions, families clutching photographs of loved ones, and townsfolk who'd come to bear witness. This community gathered today to honor its veterans, he said, his tone softer now, but no less firm. What happened here, this act of violence and disgrace, will not go unanswered. Not by this Corps, not on this soil, not today. His words hung in the air, a promise and a warning, as the crowd stirred with a mix of anger and pride. For Colonel McCabe, it was more than a speech. It was a line drawn in the earth, a declaration that some things were sacred, untouchable. At that moment, a young Marine officer approached, his boots clicking softly against the pavement. He handed the colonel a folded report, his face taut with urgency. McCabe's eyes flicked over the paper, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the details. Across the street, under the watchful eyes of fellow officers, a protester stood in custody, his hands cuffed, his face a mask of defiance and regret. This was the man who had hurled paint at Master Sergeant Becker, the bright red splatter now drying on the veteran's uniform, a garish wound against the dignity of the ceremony. Harold stood motionless, his posture rigid, but inside a storm churned, humiliation warring with pride, anger tempered by the discipline that had carried him through decades of service. He thought of his wife at home, who'd pinned his medals that morning with trembling hands, and of the young soldiers he'd mentored, who looked to him as a beacon. This act, this fleeting moment of violence, felt like a betrayal of all he'd endured. The colonel's gaze shifted to the officers across the street, then back to the crowd. "The individual responsible is in custody," he announced, his voice steady but laced with steel. "He will face formal charges, including assault and hate-based enhancements, for targeting a uniformed veteran in this sacred setting." The words landed like a verdict, and Harold felt a flicker of relief, though it did little to soothe the ache in his chest. He didn't want vengeance. He wanted the world to understand what the uniform meant, what it cost. The protest group, once a vocal throng at the edge of Maplewood Park, had dwindled as the Marines arrived, their presence a quiet but undeniable force. One of their members, a young woman with a trembling voice and eyes wide with panic, stepped forward to read a statement to a local reporter's camera. "We do not condone violence or personal attacks," she said, her words faltering as she clutched a crumpled piece of paper. "This individual acted alone, and his actions do not reflect our values." Her voice cracked, betraying her fear that the damage was done, that their cause, whatever it had been, now bore the stain of this reckless act. The crowd watched in silence, their judgment palpable. For the protesters, it was a desperate attempt to salvage their message, but it felt hollow, like a bandage on a broken bone. Their credibility had shattered the moment the paint hit Harold's chest, fracturing the fragile trust of a town that had gathered to honor, not to hate. Mayor Gobreth took the podium next, his face flushed a deep crimson, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool air. His hands shook as he gripped his notes, the paper rustling like leaves in a storm. He was a man unaccustomed to crisis, a small-town leader thrust into a moment larger than himself. Inside, he felt the weight of failure, not just his own, but the city's. He thought of his father, a Korean War veteran, and how he'd taught him to stand tall in the face of adversity. Now facing the crowd, he felt small, exposed. "On behalf of the city of Kerville," he began, his voice unsteady but resolute, "I want to issue a public apology to Master Sergeant Becker, to every veteran here today, and to the United States Marine Corps. We failed to protect this sacred space. It will not happen again." He looked at Harold, his eyes pleading for forgiveness, for understanding. Then, with nothing more to say, he stepped back, leaving the podium empty. The silence that followed was profound, a collective holding of breath, as if the town itself were grappling with its shame. No one clapped, no one cheered. Some moments demand solemnity, and this was a reckoning, a mirror held up to a community that had let its guard down. By nightfall, the story had erupted beyond Kerville's borders, spreading like wildfire across the digital landscape. A shaky video captured by a bystander's trembling hand showed the exact moment the paint struck Harold's chest, the red splatter vivid against his dark uniform. Another clip caught the low thrum of a helicopter slicing through the sky, arriving minutes after the assault, a symbol of swift response. By the time the Marines had formed their silent perimeter around Maplewood Park, their faces stoic and their presence unyielding, at least 5 live streams were broadcasting from cell phones held by stunned onlookers. The footage, shared over 4 million times, became a spark that ignited a national conversation. Headlines blazed across social media. Veteran doused in paint, Marines respond in force. Honor compromised, how a small town witnessed a big moment. Protester targets Marine, what happened next shocked the nation. Colonel McCabe's words, sharp and unyielding, became the heartbeat of the story. The uniform is not a target, it is a legacy, he'd said, and the phrase echoed across cable news channels, a soundbite that captured the raw emotion of the day. Talk shows dissected it, pundits clashed over its implications. On one side, civil rights advocates raised alarms about government overreach, warning of the dangers of militarizing civic spaces. They argued for the right to protest, for the sanctity of free speech, even when it offended. On the other, veterans, military families, and their supporters pointed to a deeper wound, an erosion of respect for those who'd served, regardless of the politics behind the wars they fought. Twitter became a battlefield, its threads a chaotic tapestry of rage and reason. You can't just storm a town with tanks because someone got offended, one user posted, their words dripping with sarcasm. Another countered, he didn't get offended, he got assaulted in full-dress uniform on a day meant to honor sacrifice. For Harold, the viral spread of the incident was both a burden and a strange kind of validation. He sat in his living room that night, the television flickering with images of himself, the paint still vivid in his mind's eye. He felt exposed, as if the world had seen him at his most vulnerable. Yet he also felt the strength of those who rallied to his side. His wife, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand, her eyes wet with tears she refused to let fall. For Colonel McCabe, the day was a reminder of why he'd stayed in uniform so long, to protect the legacy of men like Harold, to ensure their sacrifices were never reduced to a target. For Mayor Gilbreth, it was a humbling lesson in leadership, a call to do better, to be better. And for the town of Kerville, it was a moment of reckoning, a chance to rebuild trust and honor what had been tarnished. On a crisp Veterans Day morning in Kerville, Texas, Harold Becker, a retired Marine with silver hair and a spine still rigid from decades of discipline, donned his dress uniform. The deep blue fabric, adorned with medals that gleamed faintly under the autumn sun, carried the weight of memories. Nights in jungles, the roar of battle, and the quiet grief for fallen comrades. He stood at Maplewood Park, his heart swelling with pride but tempered by a quiet resolve. This day wasn't about him. It was about honoring those who never came home. Yet, as he stood there, a group of protesters approached, their voices sharp with anger, their words cutting like shrapnel. They accused him of glorifying war, of blindly serving a flawed nation. Harold's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained steady, fixed on the memorial before him. Inside a storm churn, hurt that his sacrifice was misunderstood, frustration that his silence was seen as weakness, but above all, a fierce determination to stand tall. Free speech, he knew, was their right, just as his uniform was his, but rights came with consequences, and he chose dignity over rage. He absorbed their scorn like a Marine trained to endure, making only one phone call, not to retaliate, but to ensure the ceremony continued uninterrupted. To Harold, this wasn't defiance, it was duty. The incident rippled across social media, igniting a firestorm of support for the quiet veteran. Veterans groups flooded platforms with posts, their words raw and heartfelt. Photos of dress uniforms, creased from years in storage, appeared alongside stories of sacrifice. Soldiers who carried wounded brothers through gunfire, medics who worked through exhaustion, pilots who flew one last mission knowing the odds. One post from a Vietnam-era Marine struck a deep chord. In '72, I walked through an airport, my uniform still smelling of dust and sweat. Someone spit on me. I didn't swing back. I just kept walking, head high. Wish I'd had Harold Becker beside me that day. The Marine, now frail but fierce in spirit, typed those words with trembling hands, his heart heavy with the memory of isolation, but lifted by Harold's stand. Another veteran, Master Sergeant Dana Maxwell, shared her own reflection. Harold, You showed us that the quietest man in the room often carries the heaviest burden. You reminded me why I still polish my boots every November. Her words, posted late at night, came from a place of awe and gratitude, her fingers lingering over the keyboard as she thought of her own struggles reintegrating into a world that didn't always understand. Through the chaos, Harold remained a still point, his silence louder than the clamor. National media descended on Kerville, their vans clogging the quiet streets. CNN parked outside his modest home, cameras trained on his front door, but Harold's porch light stayed dark. Reporters called, emailed, even knocked, but he turned them all away. Fame held no appeal. Going viral was a hollow goal. To him, this wasn't about being a hero or a symbol. It was about protecting the sanctity of that uniform, the memory of those it represented. His heart ached at the thought of his story being twisted into clickbait, but he pushed the fear aside, focusing on what mattered, the truth he lived, not the narrative others might craft. The only place he agreed to appear was the local VFW post, a small brick building filled with the scent of coffee and the hum of old friendships. That Friday night, with no cameras or microphones to amplify his words, Harold stepped onto a worn stage, facing a room of weathered faces, men and women who knew the cost of service, who carried the same invisible scars. His hands shook slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of their shared history. He didn't prepare a speech or read from notes. Instead, he looked into their eyes, his voice low but steady. The world's changing, they say. Maybe so, but honor doesn't bend with the times. As long as one of us remembers what this uniform means, they can't erase our truth. Then he sat down, folding his hands in his lap, his chest tight with emotion as the room rose in silent respect. Tears glistened in the eyes of some while others nodded, their hearts stirred by the simplicity of his words. The story didn't fade as headlines shifted. Harold's quiet stand became a beacon, not just for Kerville, but for a nation grappling with its relationship to those who served. His actions sparked something larger, a turning point that resonated far beyond one Texas town. Within weeks, a bipartisan bill emerged in Congress, the Veterans Public Honor Protection Act. It wasn't born in a Washington think tank or pushed by polished lobbyists. It came from the raw sincerity of a small-town mayor's public apology, his voice cracking as he spoke of failing to protect a veteran, and from Harold's unwavering resolve. The bill promised stricter penalties for assaults on uniformed veterans during commemorative events and ensured local governments had resources to secure high-risk holidays like Veterans Day. It passed the House with overwhelming support. Lawmakers on both sides moved by the story of a man who chose silence over spectacle. For many, it wasn't just legislation. It was a chance to reaffirm a commitment to those who stood in harm's way. At the state level, another movement took root, one just as profound. A coalition of veterans groups launched Honor Watch, a grassroots program with a simple mission: to ensure no veteran stood alone at a memorial. Volunteers, former soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines pledged to attend public ceremonies, not as enforcers or monitors, but as quiet pillars of support. They stood together, their presence a reminder of shared sacrifice, their faces etched with pride and resilience. Each volunteer received a red pin, the word "Remember" carved in delicate script, a talisman of their commitment. The first Honor Watch chapter sprouted in Kerville, its members meeting in the same VFW hall where Harold spoke. They didn't ask him to lead, knowing his reluctance for the spotlight, but they named him honorary captain, a title he accepted with a humble nod. Every year since, rain or shine, a small formation gathers behind the Maplewood Park Memorial. Veterans of different wars, different branches, but united by a bond that transcends time. Harold stands among them, his uniform still crisp, his heart full of gratitude for the community they've built. To him, it's not about recognition. It's about ensuring the weight of the uniform is never carried alone. On a hushed Sunday morning, the air heavy with the weight of clouds, Harold Becker, an aging Marine with lines etched deep into his weathered face, walked the familiar stone path of Maplewood Park in Kerville. The breeze whispered through the flags, their color vivid against the gray sky, each snap of fabric a quiet salute to the past. Harold's steps were slow, deliberate, his heart carrying the weight of memories too profound for words. No fanfare greeted him today. No brass band, no polished podium, no crowd to applaud his presence. Yet he was not alone in spirit. The park, once a place of discord, now bore the marks of quiet redemption. Its granite memorial gleaming with fresh paint, the names of the fallen sharp and legible once more. Harold's new dress blues, sent straight from Quantico's command office, fit him like a second skin, their crisp lines and polished buttons reflecting a pride he didn't need to voice. The uniform wasn't just cloth and thread. It was a testament, a recognition of a moment when his silence had roared louder than any protest. The letter tucked inside the package had been brief but piercing. Your silence spoke louder than any command. Semper Fidelis. Those words echoed in his mind as he approached the memorial, his gloved hand brushing the cool granite, lingering on the name of a comrade lost decades ago. The sharp pang of grief, softened by time but never gone, stirred in his chest. He could still see his friend's face, hear his laugh, feel the ache of his absence. The memorial itself had transformed since the day of the protest when chaos had threatened to drown out respect. Back then, the granite had been fading, its engraved names blurring under the relentless march of time. The town's children, led by a middle school art teacher whose heart burned with quiet purpose, had changed that. That weekend, dozens of students had gathered, paintbrushes in hand, their young faces set with determination. Some had been at the park that fateful day, witnesses to the moment Harold stood unmoving, a lone figure of dignity amidst a storm of shouts. Now they returned with their parents, some wearing roll caps, their small hands steady as they stenciled and painted. No one told them what to write, but when the work was done, a single line glowed in gold beneath the memorial's solemn etching. Freedom is never free. We saw him stand. We won't forget. Those words, raw and unpolished, carried a sanctity no machine-printed plaque could match. They spread beyond Kerville, appearing on bumper stickers, coffee mugs, and plaques sent to VFW posts across the nation. But in the park, they remained handwritten, a testament to the children's unprompted reverence. For Harold, it wasn't about the recognition. He'd never called himself a hero, never sought the spotlight. His stand that day, unyielding, silent, rooted in something deeper than anger, had sparked a quiet revolution. It reminded Kerville of something older, something sacred, honor, a quality that doesn't shout but endures. As Harold stood before the memorial, his eyes caught a new addition, a bronze plaque, simple and unadorned, set flush against the stone. Its engraving read, "To those who stood for us and still do." His breath caught a slowy exhale carrying the weight of decades, battles fought, friends lost, and a life spent choosing duty over ease. He didn't smile or salute. He simply stood, letting the moment wrap around him like a familiar embrace. Behind him, a boy and his father lingered, the child's voice a soft whisper in the quiet air. "Is that him?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with awe. The father, voice thick with pride, nodded. "That's him." Harold turned just enough to meet the boy's gaze, offering a slight nod that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of the bond between generations. Then he walked away, his step steady, his heart full. For Harold, it had never been about the crowd's applause or the clamor of recognition. It was about standing when it mattered, even when the world seemed to turn its back. The park itself seemed to hold its breath in his presence. The flowers, replanted with care, bloomed brighter, their petals a quiet tribute to resilience. The American flag, replaced and raised higher, stood prouder than before, its stars gleaming against the overcast sky. The children's work, the community's quiet effort, had transformed Maplewood Park into more than a place. It was a testament to what endures when noise fades. Harold's stand had been a spark, a reminder that dignity doesn't demand attention. It commands respect through its quiet strength. This story, though rooted in one man's choice, reaches beyond Harold Becker. It's about a town rediscovering its values, about children learning the weight of honor, about a nation pausing to remember what binds it. In a world fractured by division, where words often drown out meaning, Harold's silence spoke louder than any shout. His courage wasn't in fighting back, but in standing firm, a living reminder that honor is a daily choice, a commitment to respect, to legacy, to something greater than oneself.